At 3:47 a.m., while the world slept, something happened that may have quietly ended a 50-year global financial order, not with a treaty, not with a vote, but with boots on the ground. You saw the headlines, you heard the official explanation, but what you weren't told is why this moment changes everything. 2 days ago, a sitting head of state was removed from power by foreign soldiers, not during a war, not after a declaration, but in a lightning operation that lasted minutes and rewrote the rules overnight. The U.S. government called it a law enforcement action. The rest of the world saw something else entirely. And here's the part that should stop you cold. This wasn't about drugs. It wasn't about democracy. It wasn't even about Venezuela. It was about money. More specifically, who controls it? History doesn't usually announce itself. It whispers. And this whisper just echoed across every oil field, every central bank, every treasury office on earth. Because when the president of Venezuela was put on a plane and flown out of his own country, something else was escorted out with him. The illusion that the global dollar system is voluntary. For decades, the U.S. dollar hasn't ruled the world because of tanks or missiles. It ruled because oil was priced in dollars. Every barrel, every transaction, every nation that needed energy needed dollars first. That system has a name, the petrodollar, and it worked beautifully. Too beautifully. As long as oil flowed through the dollar stayed strong. As long as the dollar stayed strong, the U.S. could borrow endlessly, spend freely, and export inflation to the rest of the planet. But here's the uncomfortable historical truth most people never learn. The petrodollar was never just an economic agreement. It was a deal with consequences. Sell oil in dollars, and you're protected. Sell oil outside the system, and you're punished. Most countries understood that lesson without needing to test it. Venezuela did not. And that's where this story really begins. Because Venezuela isn't just another oil producer, it's the oil producer. More proven oil reserves than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, more than anyone. For half a century, Venezuela played the game. Oil for dollars. Dollars recycled back into U.S. banks, U.S. bonds, U.S. weapons. A closed loop that made everyone rich. Until one president asked a forbidden question. What happens if we stop? That question alone was dangerous. Acting on it was unforgivable. Over the years, Venezuela began doing something unthinkable. Selling oil without dollars, trading energy for goods, building financial pathways that bypassed New York entirely. At first, it was slow, almost subtle. Then it wasn't. Oil for yuan, oil for rubles, oil for infrastructure, oil for food. No dollars, no permission. Every one of those deals weakened the foundation of American financial power just a little more. And Washington noticed. But here's where history reminds us of a pattern. When diplomacy fails, when sanctions don't work, when pressure doesn't bring compliance, force appears wearing a different costume. So the narrative shifted. Suddenly, Venezuela wasn't a financial problem. It was a security threat. Suddenly, its leader wasn't inconvenient. He was a criminal. The indictment already existed. The justification was already written. All that was missing was the moment. That moment arrived at 3:47 a.m. Special forces landed. The president was detained. A plane took off. And with it, the final illusion fell away. Because no matter how carefully the words were chosen, the message to the world was unmistakable. Leave the dollar system, and this is what happens. But history has another rule most empires forget. When you enforce loyalty through fear, you don't create stability, you create urgency. Every oil-producing nation saw it instantly. Not tomorrow, not next year, immediately. Because if Venezuela could be taken, if its sovereignty could be overridden, if its president could be removed, then no one is untouchable. And that realization is far more dangerous to the petrodollar than Venezuela ever was. Because the system only works when countries believe it's safe. And now the spell is broken. In the next part, I'll take you back, step by step, through the exact historical decisions that led Venezuela here. The deals that crossed red lines, the warnings that were ignored, and why the U.S. waited years before finally pulling the trigger. Because once you see the full timeline, one thing becomes clear. January 3rd wasn't the beginning of enforcement. It was the moment the world started planning its escape. End of Part 1. Continue? Yes or no? Yes, every empire falls the same way, not from one mistake, but from one moment when everyone realizes the rules were never optional, and Venezuela was that moment. To understand why January 3rd happened, you have to rewind, not years, but decades, because history doesn't explode, it compresses. For most of the 20th century, Venezuela was the model student. Oil flowed north, dollars flowed south. Everyone smiled. American refineries depended on Venezuelan crude. Venezuelan elites depended on American banks. And the dollar quietly tightened its grip on the world. This was the golden age of the petrodollar. But history reminds us that systems built on obedience only last until someone decides to disobey. That person arrived in 1999. Hugo Chavez didn't come from Wall Street. He came from the barracks. A former military officer with a dangerous combination: charisma and questions. Why was the richest oil nation in South America still dependent? Why did oil wealth leave the country and return as debt? Why did Washington have more influence over Caracas than Caracas itself? These questions didn't break the system. What broke it was action. Chavez didn't announce a revolution. He made phone calls. He talked to countries the U.S. didn't want him talking to. He spoke about oil not as a commodity, but as leverage. Then came the moves that history books politely summarize, but policymakers never forgot. Oil nationalization, foreign companies sidelined, contracts rewritten. Then something far more symbolic: oil without dollars. At first, it looked harmless. Barter here, long-term supply deals there, but to Washington, it was a flashing red light. Because the petrodollar doesn't collapse all at once, it leaks. Every non-dollar oil deal is a pinprick. One pinprick doesn't matter, 1,000 do. And Chavez wasn't alone. China was rising. Russia was regrouping. Iran was already outside the system. Venezuela became a test case. Could a country with massive oil reserves survive outside the dollar ecosystem? Washington couldn't allow the answer to be yes. So history took a familiar turn. First, political pressure. Then, media pressure. Then, economic pressure. And finally, regime pressure. In 2002, Chavez was briefly removed. The story was framed as internal unrest, but the message was external: stay in line. Chavez returned, stronger, more defiant. That should have been the warning. Instead, the strategy shifted. If you can't remove the leader, remove the economy. Sanctions didn't begin as a hammer. They began as a scalpel, targeted, precise, limited. But history reminds us that sanctions are never about reform. They're about pain. As years passed, the pressure mounted. Oil revenue declined. Infrastructure aged. Access to global finance narrowed. Then Chavez died. And many believed the story would end quietly. It didn't. Nicolas Maduro inherited more than power. He inherited defiance. And here's the part most people miss. By the time Maduro took office, Venezuela had already crossed the point of no return. Going back to full dollar dependence wouldn't save them. It would expose them. So instead of retreating, they accelerated. More oil to China, more oil to India, more barter, more alternatives. This wasn't ideology anymore. It was survival. Sanctions escalated. Oil production collapsed. The economy imploded. And the headlines told a simple story: mismanagement, corruption, socialism. But history reminds us to compare patterns, not narratives. Countries that sell oil in dollars get lectures. Countries that sell oil outside the dollar get punished. The pattern is consistent. By the late 2010s, Venezuela was no longer just a problem. It was a precedent. Because despite economic collapse, despite sanctions, despite isolation, Venezuela didn't return to the dollar. That was the real threat. Not Venezuela's weakness, but its persistence. And then came the moment that sealed its fate. A long-term infrastructure for oil agreement, not short-term trades, not emergency deals. Structural integration, pipelines, ports, refineries. China wasn't just buying oil, it was embedding itself into Venezuela's future. That changes everything, because oil deals can be reversed. Infrastructure cannot. At that point, the calculation changed in Washington. This was no longer about punishment, it was about prevention. If Venezuela succeeded, others would follow. And once enough oil leaves the dollar system, the system collapses under its own weight. So the playbook reached its final page. Law enforcement language, military execution, maximum shock, fast, decisive, public. Not to scare Venezuela, to warn everyone else. And here's where history delivers its cruelest irony. The invasion didn't reinforce the petrodollar, it exposed it. Because now every oil-producing nation sees the same thing. The dollar system isn't maintained by trust, it's maintained by force. And that realization changes behavior overnight. Markets don't wait, governments don't wait, central banks don't wait. They plan exits, quietly, urgently. In the next part, I'll show you what happened after the invasion, the market reactions nobody expected, the diplomatic signals most people missed, and why this single operation may have accelerated the very collapse it was meant to prevent. Because once fear replaces confidence, the countdown begins. Empires don't collapse when they lose wars. They collapse when the world stops believing in the system that funds them. And that belief cracked the moment Venezuela was taken. In the 72 hours after the invasion, something strange happened. Something that shouldn't have happened, if the old rules still applied. Normally, when the U.S. flexes military power, the dollar surges. Investors rush to safety. Treasuries spike. Confidence returns. This time, the opposite. Oil jumped violently. Currencies shifted. Diplomats went silent. Because the market didn't see strength. It saw desperation. History reminds us that markets are not moral. They are predictive. And the prediction they made was brutal. If the United States is willing to physically remove a head of state to defend the dollar system, then the dollar system is no longer self-sustaining. It requires enforcement. And anything that requires enforcement is already weakening. Oil exporters understood this immediately. Saudi Arabia didn't issue threats. It delayed meetings. Russia didn't posture. It accelerated alternatives. China didn't protest loudly. It watched and adjusted. Behind closed doors, the same conversation began repeating itself across capitals. If Venezuela can be taken, what protects us? And here's the historical shift most people missed. For the first time in decades, the question wasn't, how do we stay inside the dollar system? It became, how fast can we leave without being next? That's the psychological tipping point. Because reserve currencies don't die when people sell them, they die when people plan to sell them. And that planning has now begun. Quiet diversification, bilateral trade agreements, local currency settlements, gold accumulation, nothing dramatic, nothing public, just exits. History reminds us this is exactly how Britain lost the pound, not overnight, not through invasion, through erosion. One trade deal at a time, one reserve adjustment at a time, one confidence decision at a time. The petrodollar worked because it didn't need force. Oil producers wanted access. Dollar markets were deep, liquidity was unmatched. But once the system showed teeth, the calculus changed. Because now, holding dollars isn't just an economic decision, it's a political risk, and central banks hate political risk. That's why the most dangerous consequence of January 3rd isn't oil prices, it isn't sanctions, it isn't even war, it's precedent. Venezuela is now a case study taught in real time. Lesson 1. Leaving the dollar system is possible, but dangerous. Lesson 2. Staying in the system doesn't guarantee safety, only compliance. Lesson 3. The U.S. will act unilaterally when the system is threatened. That third lesson is the killer, because once that's understood, countries stop asking for permission. They look for protection, and this is where the global order truly shifts. For decades, the U.S. offered a package deal: dollar access, security guarantees, global stability. Now, a competing package exists: alternative currencies, infrastructure investment, non-interference. China doesn't need to replace the dollar everywhere. It just needs to offer an exit ramp. And after Venezuela, that ramp looks very attractive, especially to mid-sized oil producers, countries too important to ignore, but too weak to resist alone. They don't need to abandon the dollar publicly. They just need to reduce dependence quietly. 10% here, 15% there. That's how dominance ends, not with collapse, but with dilution. The U.S. can still print dollars, but it can't force the world to want them, and that's the tragedy. The invasion of Venezuela was meant to scare the world back into line. Instead, it taught the world something far more valuable: that the dollar's power has limits, and once limits are visible, they are tested. History reminds us that every enforced system eventually overreaches. Rome did, Britain did, Spain did. Not because they were evil, but because they confused control with consent. The petrodollar was consent-based power. January 3rd turned it into enforced power. And enforced power is expensive, militarily, economically, politically. The U.S. can enforce compliance from one country. It cannot enforce it from 20. And that's the final twist in this story. By invading Venezuela to protect the dollar, the U.S. revealed it cannot protect the dollar everywhere. The world now knows the system's boundaries, and once boundaries are known, strategies change. The age of a single financial center is ending, not because America is weak, but because dominance has become too visible, too rigid, too costly. What replaces it won't be clean, or fair, or stable. It will be multipolar, messy, competitive. And history reminds us that transitions are never painless. Higher prices, volatility, uncertainty. Not tomorrow, but soon. Venezuela wasn't the end of the petrodollar. It was the moment the countdown became public. The moment the world realized the system survives, not because it's inevitable, but because it hasn't yet been escaped. Now it will be. Quietly, carefully, relentlessly. And years from now, when historians look back, they won't say the dollar collapsed because of China or Russia or sanctions. They'll point to a single night, 3:47 a.m., January 3rd, when the world learned the truth. And once truth is known, history never goes backward.